Mr. Minister, I'd like to thank you for finding time in your busy schedule to hold this exclusive interview with us. On February 24th, the military conflict between Russia and Ukraine is entering its 5th year. Do you consider its settlement in short term possible? Does Moscow see this conflict primarily as an issue of national security, or rather as an attempt to prevent more large-scale and unavoidable hostilities? Now to the question whether we consider this conflict as a confrontation between Russia and the West, the answer is yes. Ukraine is being used as a tool by the West, has been used by the West to scale up this springboard on the border with Russia to create direct threats for our security. We know that this work has been or was underway following the independence of Ukraine. It was prepared for the accession to NATO, but everyone knows that Ukrainian independence was recognized first and foremost on the basis of the Declaration of Independence, where the policy of neutrality and non-accession to military blocs was enshrined, as well as the refusal to own nuclear weapons. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation and other states of the world recognized Ukraine. In 2004, the first Maidan took place. Back then, the West, Europeans and Americans were behind that. They couldn't hold themselves. In 2014, there was another Maidan. They were asking to hold the third round of elections because the Western figure, Mr. Yushchenko, could not emerge victorious. And I remember well the words of Belgian Prime Minister before the third illegitimate route. He said that Ukrainians should decide whether they side with Europe or with Russia. This mentality, either or, we want to dominate everywhere like we have been doing for 500 years. We want to continue doing the same, to live at the expense of others and to create all kinds of threats for our competitors. And Russia has or was back then considered as a competitor on the global stage. They were hoping that it would collapse like the Soviet Union. We are aware of a number of facts, and President Putin has talked about it for multiple times. It was a combat that has been financed and prepared for in advance, including by Americans. Victoria Nuland, now not part of State of the Department of State, said genuinely that they spent $5 billion for the coup d'etat in Ukraine and turning it into an anti-Russia. You can all access this information. We're not talking about a conflict between the two countries. It's about a geopolitical conflict. And the West has attempted many times to weaken and destroy our country. Napoleon gathered the majority of European countries under the flag of the grandeur of France. It's a European approach. It's a colonial thinking. I do what I want. Now we see signs of this approach emerging on the international arena. They did not succeed. Russians entered the capital of France, Paris, and they wanted to be served in a very fast way, expedient way. That's bystro means fast. That's why you have the word bistro. Then Hitler gathered almost all Europe under his banner, including our current neighbors. I'm talking geographically. And following the Cold War, these neighbors were trying to whitewash their role in the genocide of the Soviet people and the peoples of the Soviet Union. But Hitler united all the people under the Nazi banners. And the Zelenskyy regime is a repetition of history, so to speak, but it's not a case of farce, because a lot of people fell victims to this regime. Zelenskyy is sacrificing these people. His Western patrons, masters, are doing the same. But this is a regime that adopted Nazi laws, destroyed monuments reminding about our common victory in the Great Patriotic War, the regime that glorifies Bandera, Shukhevich, and other collaborationists that were received guilty verdict at the Nuremberg trials. They're encouraging the Nazi ideology. And now in practice we see that it reflects the true essence and ambitions of the West that have not disappeared. The West is ready to resort to this hatred against all Russian to make Russia insecure. I have just given you a global answer, so to speak. Now, talking precisely about the agreement on security guarantees that is now being discussed between the US and Ukraine. Did the last meeting bring fruits? Meeting between President Putin and the American delegation, did it bring the ceasefire closer? As far as security guarantees between the US and Ukraine go, I would not touch upon it. We have not seen this agreement, and it's not the practice of ours to disclose the content of the meetings that we are conducting diplomatically, especially when it comes to the serious settlement of conflicts. But the agreement that Zelenskyy is talking about everywhere, and Minister Sybiga and a number of other Ukrainian politicians, we have not seen this agreement. But I would reiterate that in violation of all laws of diplomatic ethics, following their teachers like Macron and other people who are ready to leak all the information, bearing no responsibility for it whatsoever, well, we do not follow these practices, and we believe that everyone should treat negotiations seriously. Zelenskyy said that he has an agreement with the US, and it has been fully prepared 100%. He said we would not cede an iota of our land. We have to decide how we return the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. When I hear such statements, I have a feeling that a victor is talking now, given these statements. It's not just a victor on the battlefield in Novorossiya or Donbass, but a victor in whole Europe when confronting the United States, which started when the US administration was guided by Trump. Europe has overestimated its potential. It could not respectfully treat the policies of the new president of the US. Zelenskyy has criticized Europe that it is too soft with Trump. It should take a harsher stance. It should engage him into a greater support of the war. We do not know anything about the security guarantees, but what we know is that the question should be asked: what's going to happen next after the ceasefire, the end of the conflict? Our president has said on numerous occasions this ceasefire, a 60-day ceasefire or longer ceasefire, is not acceptable to us. Because in previous attempts connected with diplomatic efforts as part of special military operations turned into another policy of pumping the Kyiv regime with weaponry to give it a respite, to capture as many people as possible on Ukrainian street and send them to the front line as a cannon fodder, and to just receive this respite, gain new strength, and continue this war against Russia. And now, all talks on security guarantees that the Ukrainian leadership is so proud of, and the European leaders, Mr. Rutte, other ministers that are part of European Union, well, these people say that security guarantees is key to the non-resumption of this conflict. It's going to be a key to a completely different door. If you dive deeper, you'll see that the patrons of the Zelenskyy regime are doing their utmost to guarantee security for this very illegitimate regime. And we all know that in February 2014, during the coup d'etat, rooted itself in Ukraine, and the successors of this regime are still in power in Kyiv. They're still protégés of the West. They do everything to irritate Russia and to pose threats to our security. You know what's curious? I talked about it with my Turkish friends a long time ago. When we talked at the OSCE platform with our Western colleagues, everyone was saying that we need security guarantees. The security guarantees that were genuine and honest were formulated in April 2022, following the three rounds of negotiations organized by our Turkish friends in an excellent way. These were the negotiations demanded by the Ukrainian side following the start of the special military operation. They were first hosted by Belarus, but then they were held in Istanbul, in a beautiful city of Istanbul, where a couple of rounds were held. And at the initiative of Ukraine, the settlement principles were adopted. They included security guarantees for both countries, for both Russia and Ukraine, and for this whole geopolitical territory. Those were European guarantees. 5 permanent UN Security Council members, the US, France, Great Britain, China, Russia, all gave security guarantees. Another idea was that these countries would be joined by Germany and Turkey. It was not our idea. It was the an idea of Ukraine, and it was unambiguously articulated what security guarantees were: the absence of military bases, foreign military bases in Ukraine, no military exercise with the involvement of foreign troops unless it is approved by all guarantor states. It was all explained in detail. If somebody violates this agreement, the guarantor states take measures to prevent these violations, and it was close to the spirit of Article 5 of the Washington Treaty of the North Atlantic Alliance. And you all know that we said yes, and President Putin and President Erdogan have discussed this on multiple occasions. But a Boris Johnson, that you all know very well, visited Kyiv and said no. The head of the delegation of Ukraine, David Arakamia, the head of the faction, said that on multiple occasions in different interviews. Boris Johnson said no deal. This reflects, among other things, the degree of independence of the Ukrainian regime and the degree of the adequacy of those people who used to guide to rule the former colonies and do it now. It's very hard to give up the habits to dominate everything. That's why the security guarantees that would strengthen the regime that has lost its legitimacy, the regime that is the only one that has cancelled the old language of a whole people, that has prohibited the canonical Orthodox Church, that, and if you excuse me if I'm alluding to Turkish realia, has become a figure, just a figurehead of the West and Constantinople Patriarch. It all started with the support of the Biden administration, and now we see no attempts to stop the interference into the church matters from the West.
I'll reveal one secret. When we were in Alaska, when President Putin and Trump sat together, they talked about the rights of the Russians that were completely banned in Ukraine, and President Putin mentioned that not only the Russian language was banned, but also the canonical Orthodox Church, and President Trump couldn't believe it. And several times he asked Secretary Rubio whether indeed such laws had been adopted in Ukraine. So the security issue is directly related to the essence of the Ukrainian regime and the totally unacceptable statements made by Zelenskyy. Recently, he called to kill 50,000 Russians. Only that figure, according to him, would ensure a victory, while everyone sees that this person is inadequate. And let me note that up until this day, the Ukrainian constitution contains the obligation of the Ukrainian state to ensure the rights of all minorities, including linguistic rights, not to mention that the UN Charter requires that everyone respects the human rights regardless of the race, religion, and so on. Well, I started talking about Turkish colleagues. When it comes to the West, the Turkish partners and some of our partners in the BRICS and SCO, when we tell them, when you call for the peace in Ukraine, some countries in the Central Asia, they send assistance to the Ukraine regime, they have contacts, they send delegations, and we tell them, when you have conflicts and when you call for peace on the search for a mutually accepted solution, do you mention these topics related to the human rights, linguistic rights, religious rights? Well, I can't imagine another such situation. They can't give us an answer, and unfortunately, we are probably the only ones who raise these issues with the Ukraine regime. There is just one exception, which is the Trump administration. After several months, it came up with a plan of 28 points with a very clear requirement to restore the rights of national minorities, religious rights, linguistic rights, and so on. We haven't seen the document that Zelenskyy keeps calling a 20-point plan. As far as we understand, the Ukrainians and Europeans edited this plan compared to the initial plan proposed by the US, and now they try to sell this new plan. We haven't seen it, but this plan no longer contains the requirement to respect the rules of national minorities. It only mentions that the parties should show solid tolerance and be guided by the norms of the European Union. But why? The norms of the European Union, how do they apply to the... We know these European rules, they are in contradiction with the traditional values, including the values of great world religions, be it Christianity or Islam. And we don't see how they want to put it upside down. And we don't see why the European Union wants to interfere into the positive processes to make sure they can succeed. So as for the security guarantees, that would be my answer. Minister, on the one hand, we see serious differences in Europe between the allies in the NATO and the Trump administration. On the other hand, European leaders often mention the possibility of a third world war with Russia. They publish reports with scenarios of an attack, and they increase their defense budgets. Is Moscow planning a direct attack against Europe, or does it plan to employ a devastating force? What is the red line for Russia to proceed with such activities, and how do you evaluate the scenarios of NATO dissolution caused by the tensions in the relations between the US and Europe? Well, it's their business. We are not interested. NATO is a relic of the former era when the Warsaw Treaty was dissolved, when the USSR ceased to exist, when all Soviet republics gained independence, and as they continue to strengthen their independence, there is no meaning in the NATO any longer. NATO was established in order to contain the Soviet Union and its geopolitical allies. But in the West, there have been thoughts that NATO is no longer relevant and we all should engage in the OSCE. There was an idea to turn it from a conference into a true, genuine organization with its bodies, with its charter. But those prevailed who said, well, NATO should continue to exist, but it needs a raison d'être in the modern circumstances. First, they thought its raison d'être was to work in the post-Soviet, to focus on the post-Soviet space, and they had in their scope the Baltic. They enlarged in the Baltic states. They didn't comply with the criteria of NATO or EU membership. Back then, we had quite trustful relations with our Western colleagues. We asked Germany, France, and the US, why do you drag them into the NATO? They are not ready. You will only weaken your alliance and you will feel different difficulties. The answer we got from European and American partners was all the same. They said, well, they have still have phobias inherited from their shared history with the Soviet Union. They still have the phobia of occupation. of their being members of the USSR against their will, and they fear you are going to occupy them again. And now with NATO, make them members of the NATO and the EU, and they will come down, they will coexist with you as neighbors and develop the culture and the trade. None of this happened. Well, first, we can hardly say that the USSR simply occupied these countries. It is a black and white picture of the world. There were political forces in the Baltic states who realized the need to rely on the Soviet Union in order to ensure its social and economic development and its secure existence. And what the USSR did for the economy, for the infrastructure of the Baltic states, cannot be denied, although they try to do it. So instead of having calmed down, they started setting the tone. And now if you see who are the most fierce states who have anti-Russian motives, those are the Baltic states. As for the Third World War, it's exactly the Baltic states and some other active states, first of all those who came to power to Germany recently, and the French, together with the Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Rutte, and the President of the European Commission, Ms. von der Leyen. They pursue this rhetoric about the Third World War that allegedly should be launched by Russia. This political class is quite narrow. They don't even bother with inventing at least some sort of arguments. When they describe the course of the special military operation, they are full of joy that the Russia's advance is too slow, according to them. Recently, I read that Russia has colossal economic problems, that economy is no longer up to the war, that the front line is moving very slowly, and it's not up to the Moscow's expectations. So they always try to keep silent about what's happening on the front line, about the successes of the Russian troops. They don't mention that the Russians historically lived in these territories, and their rights were banned. President Zelenskyy declared that Russian children would go to the kindergartens, and the Ukrainian kids would go to the kindergartens and the schools, and the Russian children would see in the cellars. So those are the Russian children are those who we want to liberate. Ukraine regime wants to eliminate everything that is Russian, everything that has been achieved by the Russian people in those territories. So the Western countries make statements that Russia would attack Ukraine and the NATO. In their analytical materials, they say that 500 million of European and NATO soldiers would win over the Russians. Well, if they are so happy that we cannot win over Ukraine, and immediately they say that as soon as we are done with Ukraine, we would attack Europeans. Well, I can only make one conclusion. The European elites who promote this rhetoric, they simply don't see another way to mobilize their voters in order to keep power. As soon as they finish with their hysteria regarding the Russian threat, they will have to deal with very specific social and economic problems. Ursula mentions with pride, together with other actors, that finally by the end of 2027, they would get rid of Russian energy sources. But has anyone asked her at what expense it was going to happen? How much do the Germans now pay for the US LPG, with which you have substituted the Russian pipeline and the gas and the LNG from Russia following the US demands? Only Alice Weidel, who is member of the Alternative for Germany party, only they have the courage to demand an answer to these questions in the German parliament. Who is going to restore the Nord Streams that pursued the tradition of ensuring Germany with cheap Soviet and Russian energy sources, which was the basis of the economic wonder that Germany experienced, and that was the foundation for the success of German citizens. So as for the Third World War, it's not us who you should ask, but those who have no greater fantasy in order to justify their failure in power.
Thank you. You've given a very good substantive answer to my question. Minister, do you think that the discussions of US President Trump regarding Greenland and his statement, if we do not acquire Greenland, that will be done by Russia or China, is it a natural competition between great powers or a direct military provocation? Does the return of Greenland to the focus of geopolitical influence and that the Arctic will be a new Middle East? Recently, President Putin commented before the session of the Security Council of Russia, he said that it's not the issue that concerns us, it's not our matter. He recalled that the land in those areas was acquired, sold and bought, and expressed hope that the US, Denmark and Greenland would sort this out by themselves. Now, to the attempts to explain this move by Washington to secure Greenland as fast as possible. We've heard the statements, the official statements of the administration about the alleged ambitions of Russia and China regarding Greenland. But a lot of political scientists that are not part of the US administration have published a number of reports where they rely on facts that Russia had never claimed Greenland, and it does not claim it now. As far as the Arctic goes, in general, not only Greenland, it was the US when the Democrats were in power, and it was NATO member states who required to extend the responsibility NATO zone to the northern sea route. They didn't like the fact that legally and de facto, and everyone knows that, was controlled by the Russian Federation. Its security is being ensured by the Russian Federation, and the transfer of vessels is also guaranteed by the Russian Federation. Unlike Russia, which has never sent its ships to Greenland, the French naval forces, the great Arctic power, has repeatedly sent its military ships to traverse the northern sea route without adhering to the rules introduced by the Russian Federation for the security. We have seen such attempts, but even that did not make us accuse France of trying to capture the Arctic, our northern territories. We haven't even thought about it a single time with regard to Greenland. As far as Greenland is concerned, there is one interesting aspect of this matter. At the UN, Mr. Guterres, UN Secretary General, has an official representative. He's from France. Well, we've just talked about France, now I have this association. Mr. Dujarric is his name, if I'm not mistaken. And on the day following Donald Trump announcing his plans with regard to Greenland, this person was asked about the position of Secretary General about the Greenland. He's answered that the stance of Secretary General had not changed. This issue should be settled according to the international law, taking into account the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Denmark and the respect for self-determination of Greenlanders. Both sovereignty and self-determination, according to Mr. Dujarric, are enshrined in the UN Charter. There's no surprise about it, right? Four years after the start of the special military operation, following detailed explanations of the root causes of the conflict that we have already talked about, the detailed preparation of Ukraine to pose threat to the Russian Federation, for example, we know that the plan was to establish naval bases in Crimea and in the Sea of Azov. And these root causes are known to everyone: the prohibition and the annihilation of everything Russian, including the Russian Orthodox Church. We talked about it many times. And amid this background, commenting on the Ukrainian conflict following the start of the special military operation, Mr. Guterres and his French official representative kept saying that they demanded the adherence to the UN Charter, the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and the implementation of the UN General Assembly resolution. I sent letters. I argued with Mr. Guterres at the UN Security Council sessions. Our permanent representatives in New York have repeatedly asked this question. We asked officially, putting it on paper, does Mr. Guterres think that only territorial integrity important when it comes to the UN Charter? How about the right to self-determination? They gave evasive answers, like snakes, as we say in Russia. They were very slippery about giving a definite answer. They were very awkward when we were giving this answer, when we were asking them that. Now, we have turned to Mr. Guterres and his team once again. If it was said publicly that Mr. Guterres, Secretary General, and his collective leadership at the United Nations recognize the right of Greenlanders to self-determination, meaning that the residents of Greenland decide what their destiny is going to be, their fate. Well, in this case, does the UN recognize the same, that Donbas Novorossiya residents have the same right, and Crimea as well? The West and the UN leadership swallowed it, called the right to the self-determination the only principle that the Kosovo conflict should be guided by. When a couple of years following the coup d'etat, it was said that they just criticized the people of Serbia In Crimea, when a referendum was held, the West said that this right to self-determination could not be applied. Only the territorial integrity principle should be applied. The Albanians in Kosovo could have their schools, speak their language, and Belgrade secured all the rights of this historical part of the Serbian state. While in Crimea, Donbass and Novorossiya, Ukrainians legally banned that. If you talk about the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory, you will see what decision it makes. In 2020, it introduced a list of people and historical events that reflect the Russian imperialism and thus should be eradicated from or erased from the memory of the Russian people. Tolstoy, Pushkin, Lermontov, Bulgakov, and other numerous Russian, Ukrainian, and Soviet writers and artists. So I have questions. If the UN Secretariat and its leadership plays along with those who want to keep the Nazi regime in Ukraine, I think it goes beyond the purview of the Secretary General. He does not bear his responsibilities about the unbiased position, neutrality, and non-reception of any instructions from foreign leadership. I have the question about Iran. What's the main motivation of US and Israeli policies with regards to Iran? Is it nuclear problem, regional balance of power, or a wider strategy to encircle China and Russia? I think all these factors. Geopolitically, the United States, when Biden was in power, started saying that Iran is an axis of evil, an axis of states that pose a threat to the West. These states include the DPRK, Iran, Belarus, Russia. Belarus is an ally of the Russian Federation, is also sometimes on the list. They do not conceal these words. If you read the American, British analysts, you'll see that analysis. On the other hand, there is an economic and energy factor. President Trump says in plain terms, when he initiated the illegitimate operation that violates all norms of international law, including the absolute immunity of highest officials, when he just captured President Maduro, who is now with his spouse in an American prison, he said in plain terms that he needed Venezuelan oil. Iranian oil is also a resource, and I'm pretty sure that Americans would prefer these oil flows, that these oil flows are controlled. We have the Strait of Hormuz here, and just strategical nuances associated with ensuring security of oil tankers' routes. I think it's also a factor at play, taking into account officially declared principles of the Donald Trump administration, its policies. As far as the regime, as they say, in Tehran goes, Prime Minister Netanyahu has always openly said that Iran is a threat to the existence of Israel. Recently, President Putin held a number of talks with Mr. Netanyahu. We have regular contacts with the Iranian leadership. We have good relations with both Israel and Iran. We always offer our good services and talk about the need to stabilize the situation. In 2015, Russia played the key role in reaching the agreement on the Iranian nuclear program, including by transporting the access of enriched uranium from Iran to Russia above the quantity that was agreed upon for the Republic of Iran. Israelis, Americans know about that, and we would be glad to help prevent the next escalation as it happened in April during the 12-day war, when nuclear facilities were bombed. And we're talking about the facilities that were controlled by IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and IAEA has never commented on this flagrant violation of its statute and the norms of the Treaty of Non-Proliferation. And it's a good thing that there was no nuclear holocaust. This is a nuclear material that is not banned by the treaty. Of course, it poses a potential threat if you start launching strikes against it by using munitions that go deep into the ground and can go through concrete.
There have been many forecasts which state that the next attack against Iran is inevitable, but I hope common sense will prevail. And I heard that President Erdogan called to avoid the worst scenario. According to him, Turkey, just as Russia, is ready to play a mediator role. So here we have similar views, just as on several other issues. In Syria, after Assad left power, a new process began under the leadership of Lavrov. What relations and the model of cooperation with Syria does Russia plan for this new period? Well, we've had dozens of years of relations, good relations with the Syrian Arab Republic. It is a strategic sort of relations, given the support of the Soviet Union, of the Syrian Arab Republic, and our assistance for the emergence of the statehood of the Syrian Arab Republic, the fundamentals of its economy, transport infrastructure, and its armed forces. And it was a very good foundation for long-term relations which are not influenced by the current political considerations, be it in the economic sphere, in the cultural and humanitarian spheres. There are good people-to-people relations, which is also a good fabric for the relations of our relations. In December 2024, when the events you know about happened, when Lavrov with his team came to power, it was almost immediately that we and our Syrian partners expressed the mutual interest for the contacts in the new circumstances. And in January 2025, our interagency delegation visited Damascus. It met the president of the transitional period, as he was called back then. And then in 2025, President Lavrov visited. It was quite recently, in October, he visited our country. There was a meeting of the Intergovernmental Commission on Trade and Economic Cooperation. During the visit of President and his meeting with President Putin, we took stock of all the projects that we are implementing together. We have outlined the initiatives that are still relevant. I'm talking about agreements and projects, and we're working on them. As for trade, for example, it has almost reached the 1 billion level, and it's not much less than the level of the past years. And as for the MFA cooperation, my counterpart, Mr. Shibanihi, visited Moscow as part of the interagency delegation. And on the whole, we met 4 years last time. One time it was in Antalya, by the way, on the sidelines of the International Security Forum. And what do you think of the requirements to persecute Assad legally? Well, our partners know full well how it all happened, how Mr. Assad with his family came to Russia. It was in December 2024, when there was a true war, there were hostilities in the cities, and there were emotionally loaded people who really threatened his life, and it was exclusively for humanitarian reasons that we gave him an opportunity to come to Moscow, and he used this opportunity. And if you follow our internal life, Bashar Assad plays no serious role in these Syrian affairs. I have a question regarding Turkey. Is Turkey for Russia a special partner within NATO, or is it an independent force that balances the situation in the Eurasian region? Does the mediatory policy of Turkey that spans from Ukraine to Syria remain a reliable channel in the communication with Russia? Well, Turkey is our important partner. It is an important country. We have the historic memory of the Ottoman Empire and its relations with Russia in the past. It is a country in which the Turk peoples have been represented for decades, of hundreds of years. In different forms, we participate in this movement, so to say, to preserve history, to preserve the memory, to use the lessons gained from the history for good political purposes at the current stage. Some years ago, Russia initiated annual politological forum with involvement of political parties and officials. It's called Altai, the homeland of Turks. 2 such events have already been held, and the 3rd is going to take place this year in Kazakhstan. I believe it's one of examples how we cherish what makes us closer. Yes, there have been different episodes in our history, but most importantly, we should learn the right lessons. With our Turkish colleagues, under the leadership of the 2 presidents, we have quite succeeded in it, I believe. We remember such pages in our history as the independence of Turkey in 2025. We celebrated the 105th anniversary of this event. There was no Russian Federation back then, but Russia recognized the government of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey, and it not only recognized it, but also provided it financial assistance and military assistance, and it also provided gold to the Turkish government. And I believe this glorious page of our truly strategic partnership will be remembered both in our country and in the Turkish Republic. At the current stage, with all our differences and our approach as regards national interests, presidents have always managed to find similarities as regards Syria, for example, 2019, 2012. There are several summits, for example. Following these summits, agreements were reached For example, the plans, suspicions of the plans of Kurds in Syria were discussed, and now these plans are materializing in the modern Syria. The processes that we had long conceived with the Turkish partners are materializing. I'm talking about the gradual involvement of the Kurds in the army of the Syrian Arab Republic, for example. The same can be said about Libya. We have natural cooperation, we exchange information, and in a trustful manner we elaborate the possible recommendations which would make it possible to launch a process of natural reunification in Lebanon. South Caucasus is another example. It's obvious that it is our shared neighborhood, and Turkey, together with Azerbaijan, were the main initiators of the 3+3 format. Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, and their three large neighbors, Russia, Turkey, and Iran. There have been 2 ministerial meetings so far, and we are now planning a third one. Our Georgian partners, for the time being, refrain from participation, but we always stress that the door is open for them. And Hakan Fidan, my counterpart, supports the idea of holding a third ministerial meeting, and we will now trying to determine where is the venue of this meeting, and I hope we'll see some clarity soon. I'm not talking about material forms of our cooperation, be it nuclear energy, be it hydrocarbons, the Turkish stream, the South Stream. By the way, the Turkish stream, along with the infrastructure of the Caspian pipeline consortium, has on several occasions been the target of Ukraine provocators. So in the energy, we have good prospects of cooperation, not to mention trade. We all know the quality of the Turkish agricultural produce. Do you like it? Yes, I do. Well, in your view, to what extent do the concept of a multipolar world order pursued by Russia coincide and the foreign policy of Turkey focused on the national interests? Well, we make no difference in the foreign policy of independent countries who uphold their national interests on the one hand and the multipolar world order on the other hand. Quite on the contrary, the multipolar world order can only exist if there are strong countries with their strong attitudes which based on the national interests, the countries who uphold their national interests but at the same time respect the interests of others. Obviously, the larger country, the more opportunities it has to pursue its national interests successfully, and the smaller country, the more often it will have to agree with its large neighbors, but it's life. And most important thing for those who build the centers of multipolar world order, and of course Turkey is one of such centers of the Turks' world. And we see what steps have been taken and are being taken in order to deepen enhance the importance of the association of the Turk states. So the greater your weight in the international arena, the more you understand how you have to pursue and uphold your interests in the global arena, the more attention we have to pay to the small countries which are dependent on the steps taken by the larger states. Minister Lavrov, you are very respected and famous diplomat, and you have been working with your Turkish colleagues for many years. So my last question is, what is the thing that surprises or attracts you most in the Turkish diplomacy? First and foremost, the diplomatic tradition. It's a centuries-long Russians also have such a tradition. And I'm not only talking about the way the diplomats pursue communication. It's important to attract people to make informal gestures, like to offer some tea, for example, or to make a joke. But I'm also talking about the tradition in terms of the broad knowledge of the history of the own country. At least that's how we try to train our diplomats. And it ensures the continuity. You know, when you promote a policy that had been promoted by your predecessors some hundreds or 200 years ago, when it was initiated by your predecessors centuries ago, it gives you force. And if you know how specific topics had been resolved or not resolved in the past centuries, it also gives you additional arguments and helps you find fresh solutions in the modern circumstances. Not always, but again, those who know history of their own country and the interests, the fundamental interests of the country, and the geographical and geopolitical interests are dictated by the course of history itself and the geographic locations of our countries. So in my view, we have much in common, and it's a compliment for the Turkish diplomatic traditions, and I hope for a reciprocal compliment for the Russian diplomatic tradition when I say that we have much in common. But in my work with the Turkish counterpart, we always feel very comfortable. I'm talking about Hakan Fidan and his predecessors. And I'm also talking about Mr. Sverdioglu, who is Secretary General of the OSCE. If someone is able to save this organization, those are the Turkish diplomats with their talents. Thank you for this interview, Minister.